Hi, and welcome to the Q&A podcast. I'm your host, Peter Slen. Thanks for listening. Well, this week we talk with activist and actor George Takei about his internment as a child during World War II. Well, it was in 1942 that President Franklin Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066. This order deemed Japanese Americans on the West Coast as threats to national security. It forced their removal from their homes. Author and activist George Takei was 5 years old when soldiers came to his Los Angeles home and forcibly removed his family to an internment camp in Arkansas. Q&A sat down with him to talk about this period in his life and about his new children's book about that experience. The book is entitled My Lost Freedom. The podcast will begin in a moment.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
Author George Takei's most recent book is called My Lost Freedom, a Japanese-American World War II story. Mr. Takei, what's the significance of February 19th, 1942 to Japanese Americans?
Because that's a day that affected all Japanese Americans on the West Coast, approximately 125,000 of us by the latest count. We were ordered into imprisonment with no charge, no trial, no due process, a fundamental core part of our system of justice. We were imprisoned because we looked exactly like the people who bombed Pearl Harbor. Other than that, we had absolutely nothing to do with Pearl Harbor, but racial hatred and war hysteria swept the land, and all of us on the West Coast, the 125,000 that I just mentioned, were rounded up by armed U.S. soldiers, ordered out of our home, and I still vividly remember that horrible morning when they came marching up our driveway, carrying rifles with shiny bayonets on them. My brother and I, Henry, 4 years old, me, 5 years old, were looking out the front window, and we saw the soldiers marching up, stomped up the porch, steps of our porch, right in front of the window we were looking out of, and with their hands, fists, banged on the door. It was petrifying for us kids. My father came out, answered the door, and one of the soldiers pointed his bayonet at our father. Henry and I were petrified. The other soldier said, "Get your family out of this house." My father asked for 10 more minutes, which he got, and he went back to his bedroom where he and my mother were doing some packing. Came out with little boxes about this size, tied in twine, one for Henry and one for me to carry. And he was hefting 2 heavy suitcases. He said, "Follow me," and we followed him out, stood on the driveway, waiting for our mother to come out. And when she finally came out, escorted by the soldier that pointed his bayonet at our father, when she came out, she had our baby sister in one arm, a huge duffel bag on the other, and tears were streaming down her cheeks. That memory is seared into my brain. It's as vivid as I can remember.
Where were you living at the time, and what were your parents doing?
Our home, a 2-bedroom home on Garner Street, was in Los Angeles, and my father's business was a high-end dry cleaning store across the street from the most fashionable department store in Los Angeles, Bullock's Wilshire, on Wilshire Boulevard.
And your mother was a stay-at-home mother at the time?
She helped out at my father, the sewing, but yes, she took care of us kids.
And in fact, your mother, you talk about in your book that your mother snuck a sewing machine into your first internment camp.
My mother was a very practical lady. She knew she had 3 children who are rapidly growing and would be changing in size. So she smuggled in something that was contraband. Anything mechanical, anything with sharp edges, anything with sharp points were forbidden. But she knew what she knew the children would be needing. And so she wrapped the portable Singer sewing machine in a baby blanket and a few sweaters. And she, in the same duffel bag, she topped it off with Cracker Jack boxes, animal cookie boxes, lollipops, and picture books for our father to read to us. And she disguised it that way. She marched past all those armed soldiers looking so stern and severe in that heavy duffel bag. She wouldn't let anybody, even our father, help her carry that. She was going to take that in and take the risk all herself. And she marched right past the soldiers and brought it all the way to the swamps of Arkansas.
Mr. Takei, were you living in a Japanese-American neighborhood at the time?
No, it was a mixed neighborhood. And I remember a few houses down the street, I had a little friend, blonde, had blonde hair that tumbled down, and he came over to play, and he had a giggly laugh that I still remember. He was a good friend. It was a mixed neighborhood. There were Mexican Americans and white families as well.
Did you ever see your blonde friend again?
I never saw. His name was Donald. I don't remember. I don't think I knew his last name. I never saw Donald again after the soldiers took us away.
After the soldiers took you, where did you go?
Immediately, we were put on a truck with other Japanese American families with their luggage and taken downtown to the Buddhist temple in Little Tokyo, the Little Tokyo section of downtown. And we saw other Japanese American families with their luggage amassed on the sidewalk, and there was a row of buses waiting for us. We were loaded onto those buses, and the bus caravan took us to Santa Anita racetrack, unloaded, herded over to the stable area, where each family was assigned a horse stall to sleep in. I still remember my mother's mumbling, so humiliating, so degrading. My father was stone silent, but he did tell us that this was where the horses slept. And so Henry and I were excited. We get to sleep where the horses slept. So 2 different perspectives on the same common shared experience.
Your parents were Issei, correct?
No, my mother was born in Sacramento, California.
So she was Nisei.
Yes. My father was born in Japan, but he lost his mother when he was very, very young. And my widower grandfather, my father's father, decided he's going to start all over in this country called America. And he sailed to San Francisco with his 2 boys, my father being the younger of the 2, And so my father was born in Japan, but he was raised in San Francisco, educated in San Francisco, went to college in San Francisco, spoke English much better than my mother, American-born, but in the rural part. And where she was born was called Florin then, a farming area, mostly Japanese immigrant farmers. My grandparents were there. And that was like Little Japan. And so Japanese was spoken there by everybody in that area. My father grew up and was educated in San Francisco, and he spoke fluent English and Japanese. And so in camp, he was elected block manager at both camps that we were in. He was able to communicate with the immigrant generation as well as the American-born Nisei generation.
Culturally, is it important to note the difference between Issei and Nisei?
I think particularly for the Japanese American community, and I think it's the only Japanese American community is the only community that has that kind of a labeling of the generations, because each generation had a different experience. The immigrant generation obviously had a totally different immigration experience. The next generation was the generation that experienced the internment, the imprisonment in their own country. And then their children, the Sansei generation, of which I'm part, have a whole different kind of generational experience. So unlike the Italian Americans or the Polish Americans, the Japanese Americans have a distinct generational, uniquely generational experience.
George Takei, prior to February 19th, 1942, do you have memories of prejudice against Japanese Americans at all?
I was too young to know that.
Did your parents ever speak of it?
Later on, yes. But my friend was a blonde white boy. So I was too young to be aware of that. And then the confusing, scary, terrorizing experience of the internment. We were constantly being moved about, ordered by armed soldiers. And so it was a confusing, disorienting, scary experience for me as a child. From the horse stables to the swamps of Arkansas, a journey of 3 days and 2 nights across 2/3 of our country.
On a train?
On a train, through the dry, dusty, hot, sweltering desert of southwestern America. And then back again, 3 days and 2 nights to Northern California. Sere, it was a dry lake bed for centuries, as far as I know. Gritty sand, no vegetation, dramatic contrast to sultry, hot, swampy Arkansas. And that became the segregation camp for disloyals. And it was a camp with bristly armament, militarism. There were 3 barbed wire fences. The sentry towers, like all camps, had sentry towers, but it was a sentry tower with an armed soldier on guard. At Tule Lake, it was a machine gun installed there, aimed down at us. And there were 6 tanks patrolling the perimeter. And there were 3 barbed wire fences, as opposed to 1 in the other 9 camps. Tanks are vehicles of the battlefield, not goading and intimidating people that are already seething and just patrolling around the 3rd barbed wire fence.
In your book, My Lost Freedom children's book, so you don't go into this much detail there. You do talk about the fact that you and your brother Henry were excited about the train trip, in a sense.
Well, we'd never been on a train before, and Daddy told us that we were going on a long vacation in the country. And so it was not just a vacation in the country, our first train ride. But that quickly turned into a boring, dreary, hot, woozy, and it was full of old people, sick people, coughing and hacking. It was no fun at all.
Do you have an aversion to trains today because of those 2 long trips?
I love train travel. We came down from New York on the Acela, and 2 weeks ago I spoke at Dartmouth University in New Hampshire, and we went by train to Boston, and from there by car to Dartmouth. I love riding trains, and yes, it does bring back memories of those trips that we took during the Second World War. But I am able to place it all in history, and I'm not going to let that ruin a pleasurable ride in the 21st century.
What do you remember about Rower in Arkansas?
I was very young from Southern California, and I found the swamps on the other side of the barbed wire fence absolutely fascinating. It was a science fiction land, great trees rising up out of black water, and their roots came in and out like a snake going in and out of the water. Later on, my father told us about water moccasins, and my mother shrieked because we played by the ditch around a barrack, and she said, "Oh, there could have been snakes like that in those waters." And my father said, "No, not in there." But my mother insisted there might be those deadly snakes in the water there. But I was fascinated by the environment that we were surrounded by.
At what point did your consciousness say, something is wrong with this picture?
Well, it was I shouldn't say slow and gradual. There were many abrupt changes, but when the war was over, my parents decided to go back to Los Angeles. Many Japanese Americans didn't want to go back to the West Coast because of the bitter memories that they have there. And the government offered, we were literally naked. We had nothing. The government had frozen our bank accounts, drained the money out. We didn't make mortgage payments on our home. The bank took over. Business was destroyed. We had nothing at the end of the war. And just because the war is over doesn't mean people who hated us suddenly love us. The rumors were that Los Angeles was still hostile and dangerous for us. There were Caucasian friends who were known to have driven to visit people in the camps in California, and they were shot at, and so by the rednecks. And so it was still, the rumors of it being dangerous in Los Angeles was very concerning to my parents. So my father left first to scout it out and get a job and find a place to stay. And then he wrote back 10 weeks later. It was a time of great anxiety and suspense for us, and said, come on down. And so we went down. Our first home was on Skid Row in downtown LA. And that was shocking and scary for us. We were walking down the sidewalk as a family. My baby sister was now more than a toddler. She was walking. Reiko. She was, I think, 4. And we were walking down, and the whole place was overwhelming. The stink of human excrements and ugly, scary, smelly people lying around or leaning on the wall. But we were walking down the sidewalk, and there was one staggering toward us, glaring at us through the top of his eyes. And we all stopped, and my father kind of covered, my mother covered us too. And my father's fists were formed. And just as he was almost up to us, he collapsed and barfed. And our baby sister yelled, "Mama, let's go back home." Because her whole life, she went in as an infant. That was home to her, as horrible as that was. But coming to what our parents called home was horrific. It was scary, smelly, ugly, and for her, the irony was going behind those barbed wire fence was more comfortable than being back in Los Angeles. LA was a scary place when we first came back. I had a teacher that constantly called me the Jap boy, which stung. But I didn't even tell my parents that I was being called that by that hateful teacher, because I, by that time, realized it was a painful experience for my parents, and I didn't want to let them know that the teacher was calling me that word. So coming home was not a dramatic change. In fact, it got worse. It got scary, and it got to be unbearable. But my parents persevered, and I think in many ways it was their resilience that became my role models and my heroes. I learned how to cope by watching how, and experienced living with, how my parents handled all the adversity that we had inflicted on us.
And that becomes clear how you feel about your parents and my lost freedom. Did you ever go back and see the house on Garner and see what happened to it?
Many, many decades later, a journalist wanted me to go with him to that house on Garnet Street. And so my husband did some research, and we were able to find it. There was a Mexican family living there, and I recognized the configuration of the rooms and the front porch and the step in the window we were looking out of, and the soldiers that stomped up right in front of us. And it was quite shabby. This was, I guess, in the 1990s, maybe in the 21st century.
George Takei, why was your family sent to Tule Lake camp in California? You called that the camp for disloyalists.
That's right. It was a high security camp, as I said, bristly with armament, tanks, machine guns pointed at us from the sentry towers. It was a whole series. The internment was totally irrational. They categorized us not as having committed some crime, just a category, enemy alien. And that already tells you the story. We weren't the enemy, and we weren't aliens, except for my father, but he grew up in America, and he felt very American. We were categorized as enemy aliens, subjected to all that terror and imprisonment. And then a year into imprisonment, so it's 19, 42.
A year it would be 43.
1943. The government realized that we have a wartime manpower shortage. And here are all these young people, and some who actually, right after Pearl Harbor, like all young Americans, had rushed to their recruitment centers to volunteer to serve in the U.S. military. An act of patriotism, which was answered with a slap on the face, denied military service, categorized as enemy alien, and imprisoned with the rest of us. Now the government did a flip-flop. They changed their mind. They needed these people. But here they are, categorized as enemy alien, already imprisoned in barbed wire prison camps. How to rationalize drafting them out of already confinement and use them as soldiers. They came down with a notorious loyalty questionnaire. And in the chaos and confusion of wartime, incompetence got lodged in the bureaucracy of government. And it was clearly these incompetents that put together this so-called loyalty questionnaire. There were two questions that were considered critical, absolutely important that they have yes answers to. Question 27 and question 28. Question 27 asked, are you willing to serve in the United States military on combat duty wherever ordered? My parents had 3 very young children. My baby sister was, by then, a toddler. I was 6, Henry was 5. They were being essentially asked to abandon their children because they would not give any other details on what's going to happen to their children. Just, are you willing to serve in the military on combat duty wherever ordered? They were being asked to leave their children there and bear arms to defend the country that's holding their children hostage. The only rational answer that any parent could give was no. They were not about to abandon us and bear arms to fight for a country that's holding their children in prison. They answered no to that. Question 28 was one sentence with 2 conflicting ideas. It asked, will you swear your loyalty to the United States of America and forswear your loyalty to the Emperor of Japan? We're Americans. It was insulting to think that the government of the United States thought that we had an inborn racial loyalty to the emperor. It was outrageous. It was insulting. And so if you answered no, meaning I don't have a loyalty to the emperor to forswear, that no applied to the first part of the very same sentence. But it's asking for your loyalty to the United States. And some people said it might be safer to put more weight on that and answer yes to that. But then that yes applied to the second part of the same sentence, which inferred and assumed that we had an inborn racial loyalty to the emperor, so that they were confessing to a non-existent loyalty to the emperor. My parents answered honestly. They answered both those questions with no's, and with that, they were categorized as disloyal. It was totally crazy and cruel to ask that kind of question of people that are already imprisoned. And so all those that answered no's to those 2 questions had to be segregated. They can't be intermingled with loyal internees. And Tule Lake, the Northern California camp right by the Oregon border, was selected as the segregation camp for disloyals. And it was a totally different climate, in dramatic contrast to the lushness of the swamps of Arkansas. Tule Lake, first of all, became the biggest, most populous of all the 10 camps. Most camps held about from 6 to 13,000 people. Tule Lake held 18,000 people. Most of them families with children, like my parents, that didn't want to abandon their children. And it became bristly with armament. Most camps had just one barbed wire fence. Tule Lake had 2 layers of barbed wire fences. The sentry towers had more than just an armed soldier glaring down from the tower. They had machine guns installed in them, aimed down right at us. And they had a half a dozen tanks patrolling the perimeter. Tanks are battlefield vehicles, not vehicles to intimidate and goad people who are already seething with anger and resentment. And therefore, Tule Lake became the most turbulent of the 10 camps. There were fights, there were riots, there were raids. It was constant terror in Tule Lake.
What is the word washoy? If I'm saying that correctly,
yes.
What does that mean?
Well, it's a jogger's cadence. Washoy, washoy. I shouldn't say many, but a good number of the young men, some who had rushed to the recruitment centers right after Pearl Harbor, were radicalized by the irrational treatment from the government. They said, "You're going to call us the enemy? Well, by gum, we're going to show you what kind of enemy you have to deal with." These radicals were created by the government's stupidity. They were intimidated to the point, and they were people that might have been fighting for the United States into enemies of the states. And they said, "We're going to fight for Japan. When the Japanese army lands on continental United States, we're going to be fit enough to rise and join the Japanese army." And so they jogged early in the morning, and that was their cadence. Washoy, washoy. That doesn't have any meaning other than just hup two, or.
Did those young men get in trouble for?
There's more to come. I remember waking up to the distant washoy, washoy, and as they got closer, it got louder and louder. Washoy, 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 and then it faded away as they kept on jogging. But at the end of their jog, wherever they might have ended up, they gathered together and in unison, loud banzai, banzai, banzai went up, and then they scattered so that the MPs, the military police, wouldn't catch them. They had some ideas from the reports from the sentry towers, but that's what washoy was. And these radicals became real agitators in camp. They tried to get more volunteers to join them. And if some other young men didn't, they might jump them in the dark at night and beat them up. And so other young men would catch the radicals when they weren't all together and beat them up. And then other groups formed, and it was a turbulent camp full of different factions. And of course, the soldiers would come, not during the daytime because that may create a whole riot. They would come at night, having picked out certain units that they suspected of housing one of the leaders of the radicals. And and they would go in and pull them out, and their wives or their children or their mothers would be sobbing, yelling, "Take him away, don't take him away, he's innocent." Or the kids would say, "Daddy, Daddy, don't go away." I'd hear that in the middle of the night, and they would be taken away, and the remaining family would be sobbing and shouting, "The government is terrible. They're ruining our family, breaking us apart." So it was constant turmoil in Tule Lake.
What do you remember about the day that you were told you're free?
It didn't come like that. There was a long period of rumors that a horrible bomb, 2 horrible bombs, were dropped on Japan. The kind of bomb that no one had ever experienced before in the world. Whole towns, Hiroshima was completely flattened. Thousands of people died. And this was just a rumor, because we got no information from, this was a prison. We had no radio, no newspapers, shortwave radio, so most certainly were forbidden. So somehow that rumor got around. And for my mother, it was the most torturous part of the whole internment. Her parents, my grandparents, saw or felt the winds of war coming, and they left the farm in their oldest son, my uncle's care, and they returned to Japan before the war, before Pearl Harbor happened. They returned to Hiroshima. And in that whispered rumors, the first bomb had been dropped on Hiroshima. My mother was constantly breaking down in tears, and my father said it was supposed to have been a horrific bombing. You can't torture yourself like this. You can't. You have to eat. You have to try to live. And he said, let's accept that your parents had passed. And finally my mother crying stopped, and she accepted that. As it turned out, long after the end of the war, because there was very little communication, no mail, we received the news from our grandmother that they had survived. Their home was located in a place where the radiation went up because of the lay of the land. And my grandmother survived the bombing and the house collapsing on her. My grandfather, who was fairly successful in farming in Sacramento, when they went back, he was retired. And on that day, he was in the inland sea fishing. And he saw in the distance the mushroom cloud go up. So he was not in Hiroshima, but he saw it from a long ways away. And they both had survived. But that brought about the end of the war. And they said, you're free, we're going to close down the camp. But we heard rumors that the hostility didn't end just because the war is over. The hate was still intense. And we weren't sure how safe my parents weren't sure how safe it would be to go back to Los Angeles. So they decided my father would leave first to scout out the climate in Los Angeles. get a job and a place to stay. It took him 10 weeks before he wrote back and told our mother, come on down. And so we went back. My mother kept saying home to Los Angeles. I had memories of before we were incarcerated, but I didn't consider that home. Home was wherever my parents were. We arrived at Union Station in Los Angeles, and there was Daddy waiting for us on the platform. And I captured that in the last page. Daddy was hunkered down with his arms open, and Henry and I ran toward him, and with that momentum that we had going, and he was hunkered down, we knocked him over, and we kind of rolled around on the platform, hugging our father. And our mother came up, and my baby sister was hiding behind her. 10 weeks, and she had become shy. Daddy was kind of a strange man. Isn't that funny how how little children forget? She hid behind her skirt, and Daddy had to kind of draw her out to give him a hug. And she was kind of awkward about the whole thing. But we were home in Los Angeles, and coming home was not a happy time for us. The teacher kept calling me the Jap boy.
Your father worked as a dishwasher?
Yeah, he got a job as a dishwasher in a Chinatown restaurant. Only other Asians would hire us. He had enormous difficulty finding that job. But the thing was, at both camps, in Arkansas and Northern California, he was the block manager. He gave advice and assistance and other kinds of support to people who had difficulties. And here are all these people coming back from imprisonment, and they went to my father for help in finding a job or a place to stay. And my father, being he was a volunteer to a fault. He worked the breakfast dishwashing and the lunch dishwashing, and then he had a small office in Little Tokyo, an employment office, to help these people find jobs and maybe a place to stay. And my mother said, "You have to quit this volunteerism. We have to eat too." And she kept nagging him. And after about 3-4 months, he found a dry cleaning shop in East LA, a all Mexican-American barrio, a Mexican-American neighborhood. And in retrospect, thinking, I think we were lucky in going into a Mexican-American neighborhood, another oppressed group of people, and they welcomed us. My classmates were all Mexican-Americans. My friends were kids that had nicknames like Lata, Pelon, and Chichi. Their real names were Honorato, Emmanuel, and they spoke Spanish, and I learned street Spanish as well. And then I later on, in high school and college, I maintained my Spanish studies. My father used to say, I was a theater arts major at UCLA, and my minor was Latin American studies. My father said, "I have a hopeless major and a useless minor. I'm going to be supporting you for the rest of your life." Well, I showed him.
So George Takei, in the camps and at home, Japanese was spoken exclusively?
No, Japanese. My father spoke better English than my mother. My mother would say things like, the Japanese word for cut is kiru. She might be kiruing her word, cutting cucumbers in the kitchen, and she would say, go play over there, I'm kiruing this cucumber. No one else would enjoy it, understand it, except what my mother said. But she spoke, because even in Sacramento, it was a very, not Sacramento, Florin. It was a part of a farming community called Florin, which later got engulfed by Sacramento and became Sacramento. But that was a little Japanese-American community there. The grocer was from Japan, immigrant generation, and in the home they spoke Japanese. So my mother had a distinct Japanese accent. I should call it Japanese-American accent, whereas my father spoke good American English.
That's a complex, rough story that we've been talking about, your life, your early life. How do you translate that into a children's book?
Well, I tell it from the perspective of me as a 5-year-old, 4-year-old, a 5-year-old, 6-year-old, 7-year-old, 8-year-old. Perfect for a children's book, because it's those children's vantage point that I shared. And yet what was happening was something that American children should never go through again. And as a teenager, I sat down with my father to learn more about our imprisonment. I didn't understand it. I remember it, I went through it, but I wanted to get an understanding of why in this country, when this was our country, that happened. And so I had many, many after-dinner conversations with him. And he did share with me his anguish, and he said, I remember, he'd see Henry and I playing in that dusty road in Arkansas with a barbed wire fence behind us. And he had such hope and aspiration for his 2 boys. And he thought, what kind of future are my boys going to have after all this? And he said it tore him apart. And in writing about that memory, I found myself sobbing at the computer. So he shared fully his feelings with me in those after-dinner conversations. And I learned about American democracy from my father. He often quoted to me Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, the part that goes, a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. He said, those are noble words. They're what makes American democracy great. But, he said, the weakness of American democracy is in those words too. Because, he said, people are fallible human beings. Even a president is a fallible human being. He said he admired President Roosevelt back in the 30s when we were in the depth of a crushing economic depression. People were unemployed, homeless, hungry, and the spirit of America was broken. And the president had to galvanize, get the people going to bring the economy up. And he told them, there's nothing to fear but fear itself. And the people were revitalized, and the economy was revitalized by that. But when Pearl Harbor was bombed, that great president became fearful. The president who said, there's nothing to fear but fear itself. He saw that The West Coast was just like Pearl Harbor. It was open, unprepared, and vulnerable. And living on the West Coast were people that looked just like the people that bombed Pearl Harbor. And he responded like the rest of America. The hate and the racism and his lack of wisdom and leadership. He got stampeded with the rest of America and acted on race and the hysteria of the time and put us all, innocent people, in barbed wire prison camps.
What should we know about Henry and Reiko after the camps?
Well, I'm the oldest in the family. The Asian tradition is the oldest firstborn son is the one that has to show the rest of his siblings. He's got to be the supporter of the family and be an example to the others. I was a black sheep. I became an actor. My brother became a dentist. My sister became a school teacher. My brother, the dentist, is now retired. My sister, the school teacher, is now retired and living in an assisted care home. I'm the oldest and still working and still carrying on the mission.
My Lost Freedom, a Japanese-American World War II story, written by George Takei, illustrated by Michelle Lee. We appreciate your time.
Thank you very much.
And thanks for joining us on this Q&A podcast on C-SPAN Radio. Next week, it's a conversation with Christina Swarns. She's the executive director of the Innocence Project, which, since 1992, has been responsible for getting hundreds of wrongfully convicted people out of prison.